Hi, my name is Silvan Jongerius and I'm the managing partner of TechGDPR, a consultancy specialized in data protection and GDPR compliance for technology projects. The more data, the more complicated it is to comply to the GDPR. And I'm excited to join you today and talk about the specific problems of the GDPR for big data, the common misconceptions and what solutions are available, and what you can do to build better, more private and GDPR compliant products.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, wherever you are. I'm very happy to be here today talking about the GDPR challenges to big data and how to overcome them. Perhaps before we start, a little bit about myself. My name is Silvan Jongerius, based in Berlin, Germany. I'm technologist, data protection expert, also a former CTO of a large organization, entrepreneur, and right now the managing partner of a company called TechGDPR. So with TechGDPR, we are supporting technology companies with privacy and GDPR compliance. So companies in different verticals. We deal quite a bit with blockchain, artificial intelligence, machine learning, also e-commerce, a little bit of big data, streaming services, etc. So that is my background. And if you want to know more about my company, go to TechGDPR or just find and add me on LinkedIn. Always happy to connect. Right. So big data. Interesting topic, interesting conference. But then there's the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that requires data minimization. So is this in conflict? And that is what I'd like to guide you through in the next 30, 40 minutes in finding out the answer to that question. Right, to start with the General Data Protection Regulation, I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have heard about that extensively. This very scary data protection regulation with up to 20 million euros in fines or 4% of revenue. But also on the other side, if you step out of your professional life, perhaps into your personal life, this regulation that protects you gives you a lot more rights. So I'll run you quickly through some of the principles and the key elements of the GDPR before we start into analyzing how this relates itself to big data and the elements of big data. So the principles of the GDPR, if there's anything that you want to remember of it, it's probably about these principles. So principles are that data is processed in a lawful way, in a fair way, and in a transparent way. That there's a purpose limitation, so that data is only collected for a particular purpose, that data is minimized, or that only the minimum amount of data is being collected, and that data is collected and also processed in an accurate way, that there's storage limitation. Data should not be stored just forever, but there should be a limitation to that. And data should be processed with integrity and confidentiality. Last but not least, it's important that anyone dealing with this data, either as a controller or processor, and I'll get to that in a bit, that they take accountability for proper processing of that data, for keeping it secure, for dealing with these principles, and also for dealing with the other requirements of the GDPR. Even though in many aspects the GDPR is not very specific in what it requires. It was basically set up to enable the free transfer of personal data within the EU. And so basically, after goods and services could be freely transferred, principle open borders, or what the situation right now is a bit of a question, of course, but it was meant to open the borders to the free transfer of personal data within the EU by establishing the same standard in every single EU member state. It is also not so easy outside of the EU. So once you leave the European Union, there are certain countries where there's no problem transferring it to, but others where you need to take quite a few measures, and where also the GDPR prescribes that you may only export the data based on certain conditions. And also more recently, transfers to the US, where many large cloud providers are based, became a lot more difficult. So these are things to keep in mind. Perhaps I can expand a little bit on that later on. The other question is like, what is actual personal data? And the easy answer is, but also the example you see on screen is like, okay, if this is very clear information related to a person, it may be a first name, last name, zip code, email, combination, very certainly personal data. The other question is this still personal data? Looking at a last name and a zip code. And here the answer to the question, is this personal data, depends actually on the circumstances. Now, if I have a very common German last name and I live in the biggest city in Germany, in Berlin, then it is quite unlikely that this is personal data, because there may be 100, 200, or 400 people in my same zip code area with the same last name. My last name is Dutch because I'm from the Netherlands, and I live slightly outside of Berlin, where the zip code area is a lot smaller. So one could argue that the combination of my zip code and my last name would certainly be personal data, because they lead back to one single individual. It allows you to identify someone based on this data. And that is good to keep in mind when thinking about personal data, also in the context of big data, because we're talking about big, large, complex data sets. We'll get to that in a bit. What you probably heard about is the fines of the GDPR, up to 20 million euros, or up to 4% of the annual worldwide turnover in the preceding financial year. And some of the biggest GDPR fines of this year was actually this year up to this point. Was for Google with 50 million, H&M, telecom provider TIM in Italy, British Airways and Marriott. They all got very substantial fines of over 20 million based on their revenue. It's also fair to say that while these fines are very, very big, the first announcements that came out from the British regulator, the ICO, about the British Airways case, they were planning on fining them around 200 million pounds, and it was reduced to just under 20 million pounds. For Marriott, same thing. The announcement was that it would be about 100 million pound fine for them, was also significantly reduced. So yes, big fines, and certainly as data companies, something to be very aware of. But in the end, we have yet to see any bigger fines than that were issued for Google, actually, for not collecting consent in the right way. The GDPR has very clearly defined roles, and that is also something important to keep in mind. There's a data subject. There's someone whose data is being collected by an organization. There's the controller, the organization primarily collecting that data, determining the purpose and the means of the processing of that data, and then the processor, who actually only processes that data on behalf of a controller. Now these roles, it's probably one of the trickier things of figuring out GDPR roles for complex organizations with many processors, service providers, cloud hosting, etc. Who is actually who has which role? And there's also something like joint controllership, joint responsibility for data, which is a theoretical possibility and happens actually quite a few times in practice as well. Then every processing of data requires a legal basis for that data to be processed, a legal basis and a purpose. Legal base that everyone has heard of is probably consent. So collecting consent is something that you can do, and based on consent, based on permission of the data subject, you're able to process that data. But you can also process it on based on the performance of a contract. If you need to process that data to perform a contract, then there's also a legal way of doing that without asking for consent. You can have a legal obligation. Sometimes, for example, as a company, we need to keep trade invoices for 10 years, and that is a legal obligation, and there may be a name on that invoice, right? So we are obliged to keep that data. Then there are some things in the protection of vital interest of subjects, mostly medical situations, or tasks in the public interest or authority. Not very applicable to private organizations, but once you think about public administration, for example, this may come into play. And then there's legitimate interest. which is another very interesting legal basis, especially if you talk about data analysis, for example. If you can claim as an organization that you have a legitimate interest to the processing of someone's personal data, and that interest overweights the interest of the data subject to their privacy and to the data not being collected, you may build a case out of being able to process that data. It's quite delicate, and you need to do quite a bit of work in analyzing it, substantiating it. You need to write an analysis about it before putting that into force, but it can certainly be done, and it gives some more freedom if you have a good case and there's not a lot of impact to the privacy of the data subject to process data based on that. Just back to consent very briefly. Consent is tricky. And consent is tricky because it needs to be freely given. It needs to be unambiguous. It needs to be basically needs to be free choice, right? So if we don't give someone choice, like on the left side, there's a pre-ticked option, and that pre-ticked option does not really give a lot of choice because there's already a suggestion made. Same is like if we go more to the right, if we look at promoted choice, where certain options are bold, a different color. Sometimes the non-favored option is grayed out, and these are things where data subjects could later claim, okay, this is not valid consent, and this was also one of the things where Google's fine was based upon, for example. Another example is the moment that the GDPR was introduced. A very large blue-collar social media network that I shall not name also implemented their consent. They refreshed their consent, and before the GDPR was introduced, they asked everyone, okay, is this okay? Can we do that? Can we do that? Can we do that? It is very unlikely that was a valid consent at the time. Looking at that, all the dialogues featured the big blue button as a default option with the privacy unfriendly option. And if you want to choose a more privacy friendly option, you would need to tick the gray and sometimes even hidden option, right? So this is too much promoted and cannot be considered freely given consent. The other thing is around consent. What's especially relevant in the space of big data is that consent is given for a specific purpose. So if you give consent for the processing of your data for creating an account, that doesn't mean that the company also has consent to further process that for analytical purposes. So something to keep in mind. Then there are subject rights. Every data subject has certain rights to get information, to have access to their data. So if they request, okay, what data is being held on me, you should be able as a company to comply with that and give them information about that and give them a copy even. They have the right to erasure if no further legal basis exists, right of rectification, right of data portability, and then an interesting one, right not to be subjected to automated decision making. So if an automated decision using machine learning, AI, or regular algorithms use personal data to make a decision that has a impact, a real economic impact on the data subject, the data subject have the choice to say, okay, that's great, but I don't want to be subjected to that. So they can object to that then as a result. So the GDPR knows a risk-based approach. Just very briefly, it's about evaluating risk, taking appropriate measures. It's not specific. It doesn't say, okay, you need to use this kind of encryption or two-factor authentication or only these type of servers. But it said like, okay, as a controller, you are in charge and you need to make sure that you make the right choices to minimize the risk to any privacy incidents happening. Right, and it's important that if you go through that to also document that effort. Right. Then talking specifically about big data, right? This is like from our perspective. If we talk about if we look at the GDPR side, it's an important way to split the data layers up. So there's collection, storage, analysis, consumption. I think for the audience here, you probably know a lot more about big data itself than we do, but we know about the data protection side and how it relates to the GDPR. So I've basically divided it in certain ways. The collection and storage point, this is probably where we see most problems from the GDPR perspective. Is the data collected in the right way? Do we know what data has been collected, where it is, etc.? How is it stored? Where is it stored? These kind of things. Then we look at analysis. This is the section where I still see some exposure to GDPR elements. There may still be some cleaning, some transformation, some processing based on the data. But then if we look at the analysis or the further analysis and consumption stage, that's rather where information is so much abstracted that we can, I mean, not always, but in most circumstances, we're talking about anonymous data. This is statistical data, it's dashboarded data, etc. So not something that we need to worry about too much, because at this stage, not much data, not much personal data should be involved anymore. Right. So looking a little bit closer at the collection stage, right? This is where we see some of the problems, data storage as well. And then if we look at the different types of data, for example, unstructured data, is something under the GDPR. Well, this is all somewhat problematic, right? So the collection stage is all has their challenges, but unstructured data is very difficult, because it's difficult for us to know where data is and what is actually happening with it. Is personal data used in social media messages, for example? Is it used within a YouTube video, like calling out a name in a YouTube video? Still is personal data, right? But finding that data, that's much more problematic than if we talk about even semi-structured and of course structured data. So just to give you that example as well of the complexity involved here. So looking at some of the specific issues around collection, so collecting high amounts of data without a purpose. So if we look at big data and what big data, so some of the purposes that it serves, the first thing that we need is data, is large amounts of data. Where does it come from? Has it been collected appropriately? Is this something that we have collected consent for? How is it consent documented, etc.? And can we actually provide meaningful information to the data subjects of whom we collect that data about what we do with it? What are the consequences of what is happening, and is there any automated decision making involved in, like the data that we process about them, if we offer them a contract based on certain statistics or not, and which direction this would go into. Of course, if we collect any sensitive personal data or special categories of personal data under the GDPR, there are additional requirements, and one of them, for example, is that we do a data protection impact assessment. This has to do with the level of risk to the data subject. If there's a higher level of risk, we need to take more measures, like do an impact assessment or the DPO, make sure that we have all the data mapped out, etc. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we define the lawfulness of the processing and the legal base by presenting a choice to users. If we're working with consent, making sure that consent can be withdrawn. If there may be a better legal base to look at apart from consent as a long-term strategy, or perhaps at some point we can rightfully claim, if that's really the case, that the data becomes anonymous. And the moment that data is anonymous, it's not personal data anymore. And we can also say it is out of scope of the GDPR, and analysis can be done on it. And there's no problem in the big data space to deal with such data. But of course, everything up to anonymizing that data is still processing of personal data. Even the anonymization process itself is something that needs to be justified under the GDPR and needs to be done in a proper way. And then we have the issue of reusing data, where big data on a regular basis leans on existing data sets, analyzes existing data sets. If this data has been collected for a different purpose than what we are employing it for in this specific setting, then we need to be very careful about that. It's not it's illegal actually under the GDPR to just repurpose data without if it's not compatible with the original purpose. So we need to do an assessment and perhaps even need to ask for renewed consent for that. Looking at the storage layer of big data, we identified a few other issues. So Data subject rights for large amounts of data possible stored in different systems. And even, as I said again, like if it's in an unstructured format, then help like executing the rights or helping or allowing the data subjects to execute their rights is a little bit of a headache. First of all, we don't know exactly where that data is. Perhaps you can find it, but if it's hidden in a message or a video, it becomes a lot more tricky. And then the issue of re-identification. Once you collect more data, if you have multiple data sets, perhaps with one data set alone or with a small sample size, you're not able to make any sense out of it, and you're not able to reconnect that data to an individual. Once you start connecting multiple data sets, you may well have that issue that it's suddenly personal data again. It wasn't personal data in its original format, and then you take 2 or 3 databases, and then perhaps it is. And there's a good example where Netflix a while ago published 10 million movie rankings by 500,000 customers. It's part of a challenge for people to come up with better recommendation systems than the one that the company is using. And this data was anonymized by removing personal details and replacing names with random numbers to protect the privacy of the recommenders. But two researchers of the University of Texas de-anonymized some of the Netflix data by comparing rankings and timestamps with public information in the Internet Movie Database, the IMDb. So this is one example of where you need to be aware of the risk of re-identification. Some interesting things to look at if this is a space that you're working in is k-anonymity, based on sample size, and basically Google Rapport or StreamSets give you some tools that help you define what the k-anonymity is of a data set. Is your data set large enough? It's easy to hide in the forest, so to say, right? So it's very unlikely to become personal data. But if for example you collect a data set on a very small sample size of people, then re-identifying them becomes a lot easier. Just to give you that background. International transfers, I spoke about it a little bit before already. Something that is not all that easy. Within Europe, very easy. Then there are a number of countries where data can be transferred to without issues. But basically, to any other country, you need to make sure that the data is also safeguarded, even when the local legislation doesn't really supply for sufficient safeguards, right? To the US, this was the case. And if you're interested in that, look up Schrems 2, which is a recent court case of the European Court of Justice that rules that the safeguards of the US are insufficient for personal data, and basically invalidated some of the mechanisms that we had and that were largely used before. Quite interesting. Also, quite happy to expand on that in the breakout session. The breakout session on Zoom that I'm in at a later point in time. Right. So then, talking about analysis of data, where we indeed, and I mentioned this before already, but the re-identification is one of the interesting areas. There are some solutions around to think about masking, pseudonymization of data, or better anonymization of data, real anonymization of data, but already splitting up data sets and making sure that different people, different organizations have different access to these data sets. So the re-identification is not possible. It's something that is helpful in general. Adding noise and sampling, or even sometimes for statistical purposes, you could consider using synthetical data. So data sets that are regenerated from a actual data set with the same statistical values. But the personal data is removed and replaced with something completely different, synthesized data. Right, and then if we think about decision making, now once a decision based on large data sets, their analysis, their interpretations, and the learning from artificial intelligence or machine learning, once it has a real effect on a human being, on a data subject, They, for example, in recruiting, credit, for example, applying for a certain financial product. This needs to be very well explained, and there also needs to be a way of doing that. It's not always legal to use this kind of decision making, but the key here is like be as transparent as possible to in order to explain what it is that you're doing with the data, how you're using it, how it's being analyzed, and how it has an effect on someone, and also make sure that that's being explained. Okay, if our automated processes don't help you, there's a way of speaking to a human being, and this is actually something that is increasingly important to this field. Of course, like looking at when you're looking at expanding functionality of your system, think about implementing the right technical organizational measures. Think about analyzing this right from the beginning. Do we have the right systems in place? Privacy by design, data protection by design. Design this privacy element in when you're designing your systems, databases, and so forth. And the other element is that we also need to look at data protection by default. So it needs to be the default setting. You can't just assume that people are happy with the like what Facebook did, what I explained before, that they are happy with the privacy unfriendly setting, the setting to share as much data as possible, to don't go for privacy. So it should be the default setting. Looking at consumption stage of big data, what kind of problems do we have there? Like think about access controls, put granular access controls in place, need to know base. Of course, think about that there's breach control as well. So if there are any breaches of data, they need to be reported to the authorities as well. That's something to keep in mind, and also for you to understand, okay, what data is actually breaching. Do you have controls in place to understand what data may have leaked? Of course, you can't cover every scenario, but you can at least put reasonable controls in place to limit the exposure there and to understand what has happened to the data. Right, getting back to these big data layers, so the collection and storage space, because of the collection is something sensitive, needs to be done according to specific measures in specific ways. The storage like also has a lot of exposure to the data. You need to know where things are stored, etc. is the most problematic. Thinking about the analysis stage or the processing there, not too problematic. And then the last stage of the analysis, of course, assuming that there's some level of anonymity, hopefully a lot of anonymity in there, that just rather gives statistical data and insights instead of real data sets. And if that's something that you can limit and you can keep it out of these last stages, I think that is absolutely the way to go there. So thinking about, okay, what data is really needed and what do we need to work with and work on. Some other interesting data breaches that you may have heard of. Massive amounts of records on the adult video streaming website Cam4. They had their Elasticsearch server breached, exposing over 10 billion records, all kind of sensitive data, obviously. Aadhaar, there were names, unique 12-digit identity numbers of 1.1 billion people breached, of basically retina scans, thumbprints, photographs, and other identifying details of nearly every Indian citizen. And there's some more examples. But all these large data sets, these large collections of data, are of course also a high value target for attack, right? So there are some of the things that we also work on. Decentralization. How do you decentralize data sets? Is there a way of still doing the same thing, but not keeping the data in a central place, because that greatly reduces the value of the attack targets for hackers in this case. And there are still ways, especially given new technologies and there are a couple of interesting companies working on that to bring the compute to the data instead of the data to the compute. So one of the things that you could consider to remedy these kind of issues. Other things to do is, for example, appointing a data protection officer, someone who can basically support you in the compliance, can oversee your activities, especially if you're doing systematic monitoring or analysis of data subjects on a large scale. If your core activities are processing on a large scale, and also keep a record of processing activities or create a data map. So having this insight and having such a position appointed is something that is quite essential for companies dealing with large data sets, especially if kinds of personal data, even if it's adjacent, if it's not really directly personal data, but if it's involved, you rather want to be you want to be safe about it, and you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing to avoid these massive fines. Right. So the question that I started with was big data versus data minimization. Is this actually something that can be joined in a certain way? And I'm thinking that just going through the different points, that there are certainly ways of uniting it, and there are ways of doing the right thing while you're still working on large data sets and you're still getting the insight that you want, but perhaps you don't need to collect these names or dates of births. Perhaps what you want to collect is a month of birth, perhaps, or a year of birth. Perhaps that's precise enough, or there are ways of splitting that up in multiple data sets. So it's minimization, and perhaps also thinking about the storage limitation. That's another interesting point where, and I mentioned that only in the beginning, where there's actually the GDPR does not really allow for data to be stored, or personal data to be stored, forever. So you always need to think about, what is my data life cycle? Where does it go afterwards? And when do I retire the data? And how do I go about? And do I still get the same statistical information? Now, knowing that you need to retire data at some point, you may want to speed up that process, do more analysis up front, and keep more of the outcomes instead of some of the raw data. You may have possibilities of doing parts of that at some point as well. But right, to understand when data or when data should be retired, if it's about personal data, you may well want to add some extra data fields as well. You may, in your database or in your data lake, include things like the collection date, the legal base that was collected upon, especially if you have complex data sets with different sources where data comes from different sites, from different collection methods. You do want to know these kind of things, because at some point you will need to retire that data, and you need to have mechanisms in place to understand what data should be retired, when it should be retired. I'm thinking about some more closing thoughts. I think those things are pretty interesting. Of course, make sure that systems are kept secure, but also think about the purpose that you collect data for. Like, once you are collecting data that you intend to use for analysis purposes at a later point in time, you may as well want to include that in the privacy policy. Say, okay, this data is collected for example, account creation. But it's also collected for us to better understand how our customers are doing their online shopping, and then you have the purpose covered, and you don't need to either go into shady directions of repurposing that, and how are you going to communicate that to your users, etc. So it's much better if you're able to think about that from the very beginning. All right. let me conclude a little bit about what we do as TechGDPR as a company. We're a consultancy. We help with GDPR audits of complex technical products. We deal quite a bit with blockchain, with artificial intelligence, machine learning, e-commerce. There's some big data, streaming, etc. in there, and we do that through an audit, through discovery workshop, data mapping, compliance reporting, which is normally integrated into a project to get a first overview and report on the GDPR state of compliance and suggest optimizations. We also help with GDPR training. We do in-house training. We're currently putting the last hand on a GDPR for developers online course, which should be available in about a month, perhaps 2 months from now, on an individual base or for organizations. We consult on privacy by design, building the right products right from the ground up. And we also offer data protection officer services for technology companies. The other thing that we do that we don't charge for is we make some online resources available. There's also going to be a summary of this talk, or at least of the main points for GDPR in big data, published on our blog probably today or tomorrow. But one of the tools that we have developed is the TechGDPR Canvas, or actually the GDPR Canvas, where we have the possibility of running through in a workshop kind of format with our customers, and you can also do it independently through these different steps. So you have the possibility to very easily and quickly map out in a group setting the key activities in data protection. And once you do this with a group, you already start to get a better understanding of your processing activities within the company, within a project perhaps, and you can start to define, okay, what are actually the purposes for this data collection? What are the processing activities that we engage in? Who are the processors? Like, which companies do we include in our processing activities? Right, and that is probably what I would conclude with. Those are the things that you can do yourself within your team, within a small project, a bit or a big project, and make a start already in understanding this, or getting a further understanding, either in the beginning or once it's already rolled out, and afterwards you have a much better idea of what you're going to need and what your problems are on the GDPR side. So if you want to have a look at this, it's available for download for free in very big formats. You can easily get it, download it, and run it through a printer, or bring it to a print shop to get it in big format. If you're in Berlin, Germany, come by to our office to get a massive version for free. Just let us know, contact us. Okay, well, that's it from my side. I would love it if you would connect with me either on Twitter or LinkedIn. Those are the places where I'm most active. Just write quickly that you have attended the conference session here. I'm happy to accept your request and connect with you. Then in terms of questions, we have the Slido. So if you have questions, you can put them in the Slido. I'm not sure if there are questions for me already. I'll have a look at that very soon. And also afterwards, I'll be in the speaker corner on Zoom for a little bit. So if you want to just talk with me on a one-to-one in the Zoom room about certain specific elements, then please join that one. Happy to talk to you for another, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes perhaps. Let me have a look if there are any questions. Right, so I got a question here. How to make sure that data in initial data layers is safe and not breaching GDPR? Which layer is most common for data anonymization? That's a great question. Well, I think what data is most common for data anonymization depends a little bit on your use case. From our GDPR perspective, we would say the earlier the better, because it reduces your risk. right? Of course, you need to understand up to where do you need the personal elements in this data, and in terms of making sure that the data, it's actually two questions. In terms of making sure that the data is safe and not breaching GDPR, there are a couple of things, of course, that you need to do for that. One is making sure that you collect it under the right premise, with the right purpose, the right legal base. The other thing is that you can locate the data, that you know what is being processed. If you don't know what data you're processing of people or of whom you're processing it, that's a problem already right away. So making sure that these, let's say, legal requirements are in place, and then you have also the technical organizational requirements. So the GDPR requires you to take appropriate technical organizational measures. So what does that mean? Well, it depends, right? Depending on your use case, this may be employing encryption, for example. It may be setting up two-factor authentication for anyone with access to that data. It may be it may be different elements as well in terms of password policies, making sure that that if it's anything on-prem, that you make sure that the physical access is limited, that there's proper user management in place. It is basically this whole surrounding of all the different things that you would need to do to make sure that you meet the requirements of the GDPR and you keep that data safe and secure. Having said that, getting back to the anonymization, the earlier you can anonymize, the better, because it moves the really anonymized data out of scope of the GDPR. And anonymization, don't want to keep pondering on this, but anonymization is difficult, right? There's a 37-page document from the Working Party 29 from 2014. Working Party 29 being the previous data protection board, what is now called in Europe the Data Protection Board, the highest decision-making authority on data protection. They issued guidelines on anonymization and pseudonymization. So when is something pseudonymized? When is it anonymized? And the bar for really being able to call something anonymized data is very, very high. I would certainly say that that is something where you would want to be very careful of. You would want to do some tests, and you want to make sure that that's truly anonymized and that it cannot be de-anonymized. I'm sorry, especially when you collect different data sets. Think about the Netflix case, for example. So yeah, not that difficult. Not that easy. Let me see if there are any other questions.